In the heart of the unforgiving Southwest, where the dry heat of the desert stretched across endless miles of barren land, Luke Donovan worked tirelessly to keep his ranch alive. He was a cowboy at heart, born and raised on the harsh, untamed frontier. Life had always been a struggle, but lately it felt like the world was closing in on him. The cattle were sick, the crops had failed, and the bank had started sending letters, threatening to take everything he had worked for. Luke didn't have many options. His pride told him to keep fighting, to hold on to what was his. But as the days went by, it became harder to deny that he was running out of time. He needed help, he needed money, or his ranch would be lost forever. Then one morning a man named Barker rode onto his property. Barker was a neighbor, but not a friendly one. The two had barely spoken in years, but today he had something Luke couldn't ignore. "I've got a deal for you, Donovan," Barker said, his voice rough and sharp like the desert wind. "You need money, and I've got a way to settle your debts. You don't have to do anything, just accept it." Luke eyed the man suspiciously. "What kind of deal are we talking about?" Barker grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "I've got something you can use, something valuable. An Apache woman. A prisoner. She's yours for the right price." Luke's heart skipped a beat. The Apache, hostile, unpredictable, and dangerous. He had spent years hearing stories about their raids on settlers, and their constant defiance of the law. But now here was a chance to trade one of them for something that could save his ranch. The thought made him uneasy, but desperation made his decision easier. His eyes narrowed as he thought about the woman. A prisoner? Probably just another piece of livestock, he figured. "How much are you asking?" Luke asked, trying to sound uninterested even though his curiosity had already been piqued. Barker chuckled. "You won't need to pay me in cash. Take her off my hands and your debt is cleared." Luke wasn't sure what to make of it. He didn't know the details, why she was captured, how she came into Barker's possession. But the deal seemed too good to refuse. And so, after a few moments of thought, he agreed. That's how he found himself standing at the edge of his property, waiting for Barker to bring the woman. It wasn't what he had expected. He had imagined a ragged, wild-looking figure, a woman who looked like she had been broken by captivity. But when Barker finally arrived, leading her behind him on a rope, Luke was struck by what he saw. The woman was unlike any Apache woman he had ever heard of. She stood tall and proud, her posture rigid as if she carried herself with a sense of dignity far beyond her circumstances. She had long, dark hair that flowed down her back in smooth waves. Her eyes were a deep, piercing brown, sharp with intelligence and fire. She didn't look frightened or weak. In fact, there was something about her, something powerful that made Luke take a step back. Barker smirked, noticing the look on Luke's face. "She's a handful, but she'll work for you. She knows how to survive out here, that's for sure. But don't expect any gratitude." Luke didn't know what to say. He had thought this woman would be a burden, someone to do chores, maybe help out with the work on the ranch. But now, seeing her stand with such strength, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Her name was Ayanna, though Luke didn't know it at the time. She didn't speak much, just nodded curtly when Barker introduced her. Her silence made Luke uncomfortable. She was a prisoner, and yet there was something in her gaze that suggested she was anything but submissive. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that this was no ordinary situation. "Take her inside." "Get her settled," Barker instructed. Before turning on his heel and riding off, Luke hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to handle this situation. What was he supposed to do with a woman he knew so little about? And why did she seem so different from the others he had heard about in stories? She wasn't acting like a prisoner. She wasn't scared, and she didn't look like someone who had given up hope. "Come on," Luke muttered, trying to push his uncertainty aside. He motioned for Ayanna to follow him into the house. She walked behind him without a word, but Luke noticed she didn't look around at the ranch like most newcomers would. She simply walked, her expression unreadable. They entered the small cabin, and Luke set her to work in the kitchen. He didn't want to seem too soft, so he kept his instructions short and simple. But it quickly became clear that Ayanna wasn't someone to be easily told what to do. She worked quietly, her movements efficient and precise. She had an air of authority, even though she was bound by ropes. As the days passed, Luke couldn't help but watch her. She had a quiet strength, a grace that surprised him. She didn't complain, but there was a quiet defiance in everything she did. She didn't look like someone who had been defeated by her captors. No, Ayanna was someone who was biding her time, waiting for the right moment. Luke found himself intrigued by her. He had expected her to be broken, frightened, but she was nothing like that. There was something about her that made him question everything he had ever believed about the Apache. Growing up, he had always been told that they were wild, savage people, but Ayanna didn't fit that description at all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Luke found himself alone with her by the fire. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across her face. For the first time, he found himself speaking to her, despite the language barrier. "You're not like the others," he said, not sure why he was speaking at all. Ayanna glanced at him, her eyes steady and calculating. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. "I've heard stories. About the Apache. About how you fight, how you raid," Luke said, his voice gruff. "But you're different." For a long moment there was silence. Ayanna didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply stared into the fire as though deciding whether or not she should speak. Finally, she looked at him and said, "You think you know who I am, but you don't." Luke felt a shiver run down his spine. He had no idea what she meant, but he could sense that she was holding something back. He wondered if he would ever understand the woman he had been forced to accept as payment. What was her story? And why had she been so calm, so composed despite everything? Little did he know, Ayanna's story was far more complicated than anything he could have imagined. Luke woke up the next morning with a strange feeling in his stomach. The sun had barely risen, casting an orange glow over the desert. He had no reason to be up so early, but something was pulling him outside. He had spent the past few days wondering about Ayanna, her calm demeanor, her mysterious silence, and the strength she carried in her quiet way. But something felt different today. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't quite see. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. The ranch was quiet, but in the distance Luke saw a dust trail rising in the air, far off toward the horizon. At first he thought it was just another traveler or perhaps a herd of wild animals, but then the dust grew thicker, and he knew something wasn't right. The wind had shifted and the horses were agitated. They were restless, pacing back and forth in their corral. Luke's instincts kicked in and his heart began to race. He grabbed his hat, pulled it low over his eyes, and sprinted toward the barn. He had no idea who was coming, but one thing was clear. Their arrival wasn't going to be peaceful. Before he could saddle up his horse, the sound of thundering hooves reached his ears. It wasn't just one or two riders. There were dozens. His blood ran cold. Apache warriors. They were coming for Ayanna. Luke's first instinct was to grab his rifle, but he knew that wasn't enough. He couldn't take on a whole tribe by himself. Panic gripped him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think fast. If Ayanna's people were coming, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Her. He turned to the house, but before he could take a step, he heard a voice behind him. "Luke." It was Ayanna. She stood in the doorway, her face as calm as ever, though her eyes were sharp and focused. "Get inside," Luke ordered, his voice low and urgent. He didn't want her caught in the crossfire, but Ayanna wasn't moving. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch and stood next to him, her eyes scanning the horizon. "They're coming for me," she said quietly, almost as if she were stating a simple fact. Luke turned to face her, confusion written across his face. "What do you mean? Who are they?" Ayanna's gaze never wavered from the approaching riders. "My father's warriors. They've come to rescue me." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had heard stories about Apache raids, but he never expected to find himself in the middle of one. "Rescue you?" He shook his head, still trying to grasp what she was saying. "You never told me. You never said anything about being part of their tribe." Ayanna turned to look at him, and for the first time Luke saw something more in her eyes. A flicker of emotion, something that bordered on sadness or maybe regret. "I didn't want to tell you," she said softly. "It would have been too dangerous for you to know." Luke's mind raced. His first instinct was to run, to protect her, but everything he had thought he knew about this woman was now being challenged. She wasn't just a captured slave. She was the daughter of the Apache chief, and now her people were coming for her, probably with violence in mind, and Luke found himself in the middle of it all. As the riders drew closer, Luke could see them more clearly. Warriors dressed in furs with painted faces and spears in hand. They rode fast, like a storm moving across the desert, and the ground shook beneath their horses. Luke felt a wave of dread wash over him, but there was something else too. He couldn't deny it. He felt a pull toward Ayanna, a sense of loyalty and protectiveness that he had never expected. His feelings for her were deeper than he realized, and the thought of losing her now made his chest tighten. "What do we do?" Luke asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ayanna's face remained calm, but her eyes were sharper than ever. "You don't have to do anything. This is my battle, not yours. I just wanted you to know who I really am." Before Luke could respond, the riders were upon them. The dust cloud swirled around them as the Apache warriors dismounted and surrounded the ranch. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he thought he might have to fight for his life. Then, from the center of the group, a tall man stepped forward, his features stern and commanding. He was older than the others, with a long beard and piercing eyes. He looked directly at Ayanna. "You've returned, daughter," the man said, his voice deep and firm. There was no mistaking his authority. This was the Apache chief. Luke's stomach dropped. The man standing before him was none other than Ayanna's father, the chief. And he was here to take her back. Ayanna stepped forward and looked at her father, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she glanced at Luke, her eyes filled with something Luke couldn't read, perhaps regret, perhaps a hint of sorrow. "Father," she said, her voice steady, "I'm not going back with you. I've made my choice." The Apache chief's eyes softened for just a moment before he hardened his gaze again. "You cannot refuse your people, Ayanna. You are our leader. You are meant to help guide us." "I'm not your leader anymore," Ayanna replied, her voice full of conviction. "I've chosen my own path. I've chosen this man, this life." Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he looked at Ayanna in disbelief. She had chosen him? But how could she? The Apache chief wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol of power, and Ayanna was his daughter. If she refused to go back, it could mean disaster for both of them. The tension between father and daughter was palpable. The chief stared at Ayanna for a long moment before he turned his eyes toward Luke, sizing him up. Luke stood tall, his chest rising and falling with every breath, but he felt small in the presence of the Apache chief. This man held the power to destroy everything Luke had built in an instant, yet he couldn't bring himself to back down. "If you won't return with me, Ayanna, then you leave me no choice," the chief said, his voice cold. "You will have to live with the consequences." Ayanna nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I will face whatever comes. I've made my choice." Luke stood there, feeling a strange mixture of fear and respect for Ayanna. She wasn't just a captive. She was a leader in her own right, and she had the strength to choose her own destiny no matter the cost. The Apache chief glared at Luke for a moment longer, then turned to his warriors. He motioned for them to mount their horses. "We will leave for now, but this is not over. The Apache will remember." With that, the warriors turned their horses around, slowly riding off into the desert. The dust settled, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Luke and Ayanna stood side by side, each lost in their own thoughts. Luke couldn't help but feel a sense of awe for Ayanna. She had just defied her own father, the chief of the Apache tribe, to stay with him, and yet in that moment he wasn't sure what to feel. She was no longer just a prisoner to him. She had become something far more, someone he didn't fully understand, but someone he cared about more than he was ready to admit. The day was just beginning, but Luke knew things would never be the same. The Apache were not gone forever. They would return, and when they did, Luke would have to face the consequences of his own choices.